hear me? You see me?
Yes.
You see my screen? Oh my gosh, technology. It just betrays me today. Well, anyway, take 3 starting to talk about the state of open source databases. And you know what, I just listened to Robert Hodges, and it's interesting what he seems to be talking about some of his similar trends. So, well, that's good. So first, I'll talk about the innovation which happens in the open source database space. I think the first one, which is very interesting, is for us moving to the distributed databases. I think that is especially important in an analytical database, which tends to work with a larger data set, because guess what? If you just keep a process in a single node, you can't really process a lot of data. Separation of storage and compute is another trend. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because Robert just spoke about that. But I think what is interesting is that empowers the other trend, which is quite interesting, is introduction of a serverless databases. And especially in the cloud, you can think about that as a serverless deployment and pricing model, where you are no more deploying a set of servers, but actually think about that in the context of a data size, volume of transactions, maybe query complexity, and so on and so forth. Another trend which Robert mentioned as well is hybrid transactional and analytical processing, which again, I don't think I have much to add here, and we'll have a panel of following that. And these trends kind of coexist with their data pipelines, where one trend we say, well, you know what, we have a single database which is able to do everything. In other, we may have a data pipeline, how we are moving data around, maybe from our operational database to analytical database, maybe to, you know, full text search application, and so on and so forth. The other trend, which is quite important, is what we now see many companies use a lot more databases than before, right? As you talk to companies, many of them use, 10 or even more databases, and I think that is driven by those 3 trends that outlined here. One is the microservices-based deployment models. There we can have a lot of services which contain the data they operate with, and with that, they may be choosing a different data stores which are best to provide the outcome they are looking for. Developers authority, that means what the databases are often chosen by developers, rather than you have, let's say, some database operations team say, well, you know what, you can pick Oracle or Oracle, and if you want something else, well, you're out of luck, right? Now developers make choices. And the third thing is the cloud, and especially database and the service in the cloud, which enables that in many cases, because now developers can often make that choice, but then let's give somebody else their responsibility to actually setting up and managing the database, right? Which they may not be particularly excited about. With that, of course, we have many different models. It's not just relational anymore, but we have a time series, graph databases, document databases, something like Redis, which offers us the data structure. And also, we have databases which are now supporting multiple data models, right, and talk different languages protocols, right? And I think that is interesting how that also kind of combines with that hybrid analytical transactional thread, right? That's, you can think as about another angle, where you're saying, well, it's not about different ways to deal with relational data, but actually we are going to allow the database to have multiple different data models inside one of them. Here are some interesting examples. I think for ClickHouse folks, for example, it was brilliant to, in addition to a ClickHouse native protocol, speak a protocol of the two most popular open source relational databases, MySQL and Postgres. So if your application can connect to one of those, well, you can use the same connector, connect to ClickHouse, no changes needed. That is fantastic. Victoria Metrics time series database also is which plays in this field, having different inject API, and FerretDB is an extension, like, or well, actually sort of like a stateless proxy, which allows you to use PostgreSQL as if it were or would be a MongoDB database, right? Which is kind of similar to a Babelfish extension, which turns the same PostgreSQL as a Microsoft SQL Server compatible database, right? And I think what was interesting to hear from one extent there, Robert mentioned what the influence of Postgres to the analytical landscape is decreasing, but there is still a lot of stuff where PostgreSQL is based as a foundation of a new development, either as the base, like for storage, or as an inspiration for on a protocol level, right? You think about CockroachDB, Yugabytes, new distributed database technologies, they picked PostgreSQL protocol. Well, this is a very brief coverage of technology landscape, and let's now talk about maybe more on the business side and the open source side. Now, what is the biggest factor impacting open source from right now? Right. Well, if we would be speaking face to face, I'll probably poke with some people and ask you to tell me your opinion. But now we're doing that virtually, so I'm not going to do that. I'll just tell you my answer, which is the cloud. Over the last 5 years, so maybe slightly more, really the open source landscape, and not just in the database space, was really impacted by the cloud a lot. And I think the best illustration about that is this. For quite a few years, we had the open source databases as getting database of the year by DB Engine standard, which is basically the database which gets the most growth, most traction in a given year. And what do we see in 2021? The database of the year is a Snow fucking Lake, right? Which is not open source database at all, right? Again, in the first time in quite a few years, which signals this kind of how much innovation going on in the cloud, and also I think importance of the analytical databases in a modern world, right, which is raising probably compared to a truly transactional operation database. Now let's look at the cloud impact. What exactly is going on here? The cloud impact, I think, is interesting because on one extent, it really maximizes and helps to simplify adoption of software. For example, a lot of arrays in PostgreSQL popularity, I think, because it became available in the cloud, and now you could have an awesome PostgreSQL features developers admire, but not have to deal with the messy stuff of managing high availability replication, so on and so forth. At the same time, it changes opportunity for monetization. Basically, who gets the money. Now, if you think about the open source itself, that would not be that a big deal, because as Martin Mikus used to say, the open source is not a business model. It's maybe distribution model, maybe development model, but not quite quite a business model. And that is the business model which comes with that open source is important, right? And you can think about that in two big groups, right? You have the open source, which I will call like foundation-driven, a community-driven, think Postgres, right? Or single vendor-driven, as something like MySQL. And there is a lot of kind of, a little bit of shades of gray here, right? Because Elastic, for example, on one extent was a single single vendor-driven landscape, but software. But then they, well, relicensed that. Turned out it was large enough community, right, contributing to that, so they kind of created the fork, right? If you think about the foundation-driven open source, they actually really focused on the cloud, which helps to accelerate adoption. And the fact that cloud changes who captures the value is not really that big of a deal, right? Again, think about Postgres. Well, in the past, Enterprise DB was the biggest dog. Right now, it's probably AWS. But who really cares? Because the PostgreSQL community gets those engineering brains we're looking for, right? It just they happen to employed by their different corporations those days. If you think about the single vendor, those tend to be venture funded or public companies which don't like competition with the cloud vendors, right? And fear of a threat, right? And you see a lot of that being exposed. Oh, that is unfair. Somebody dares to compete with us on our own turf. Well, hey folks, didn't you know that when you started the open source business, that is kind of that point, what multiple people can cooperate and compete with the same source code? Well, anyway, we can see what a lot of those venture funded companies have been fully or partly abandoning the open source licenses. And if I forgot you, not mentioned you on this slide, and you hate open source as much as those companies do, please forgive me. There are so many of you, I could not list everybody on the same slides. What is interesting here, though, is how that changes the ranking after license change. I found this graph very interesting. There we can see Elastic, who changed the license to non-open source. They were like got a fork. OpenSearch basically in the next couple of weeks or months, right? And we can see in the engine rankings how Elasticsearch started to lose popularity just as open source is growing very rapidly. Note though, this is a logarithmic scale, right? So we have to be kind of taken with a grain of salt. Another company we changed the license is famously MongoDB, and of course, so far they are doing pretty well as a business, right? They're in public, have some significant valuation, revenue growth, and so on and so forth. But what you can also see from what they are have been overtaken by the Postgres since about that time when they refocused their focus from being the open source database, right? And in the last couple of years, by DB Engine's ranking, right, which measures kind of adoption more than revenue, they have been quite stagnant. So I think especially from adoption standpoint, you have to be careful with license change if that's something you care about. Now, what is the primary goal of the license change in this case is, of course, creating monopoly on this database as a service market. Now, why do we care about database as a service, right? Should not just say, hey, who cares? Let them own the database as a service, and we're just going to continue manage database in the old-fashioned way. Well, the thing here is what this gives us: state-of-the-art simplicity, high level of automation, and really helps developers to focus on an application rather than on a database. And what is the problem with a monopoly on database as a service? Well, because then solution becomes not really different from proprietary software, especially if you keep into account is what many companies do not really have that skill to manually own database setup. right? So database as a service is basically a requirement for them. And if the vendor creates a situation where only one vendor can offer database as a service, well, that is a problem for database as a service vendor lock-in. And now you may say, well, that is not really painful right now, right? And your favorite database as a service vendor charges you the general the fair prices. But I think if there is not competition, if there is a database as a service, something like MongoDB, right, or Amazon Aurora, which can be only provided by the single vendor, right, or a single vendor permission, then things are going to just become more painful, if history can teach us anything here, right? Now, if you are not recognizing this good-looking guy, this is actually Larry Ellison in his youth, right? And at the time, Oracle was actually helping to save customers from IBM hardware lock-in with mainframe computers, right, by introducing Oracle database. But guess what? Now, a few decades later, and it is Oracle, which we refer as a company which doesn't have customers, but has hostages. Now, why data is really special, in my opinion? Because moving data is expensive, and moving lots of data is very expensive, right? And that is what makes data more sticky than in many other situations, right? That is why you would see a lot of database startups, right? Especially the software as a service. They have very good valuation multiples because, hey, you know what? Likely if that gets adopted, it's would be very hard for somebody to move a lot of data to their different platform. Well, with that all doom and gloom, right? I don't think it's all lost. I think we've kind of seen that before, right? I remember when I was starting with open source in early 2000s, right? We had been kind of in a similar situation where if you would be looking at this well integration, well polished tools, right? That would be something proprietary, and in open source space, we would be, writing Perl or PHP code in VI. Or operating system, some of you may not remember, but Linux was considered a toy, which was a 32-bit operating system, which didn't have a good SMP support, right? And you couldn't even have the file size more than 2 gigabytes in size. But guess what? Now it is dominant and replaced Solaris, HPX, AX, and the real operating system on the past. And I believe in this open source space, we'll see open source catches up again with our clouds. And I use AWS here as an example, obviously the biggest and most successful cloud vendors. But if you look at the other hyperscalers, their strategy is basically the same, is really to make sure that you are as much locked in as possible within their infrastructure. But you can take another choice and use Kubernetes-based or cloud-native infrastructure. As Robert says, Kubernetes is awesome and getting a lot of traction recently. And cloud native landscape is also growing rapidly, right? I like to show this picture because it highlights how many of the companies are doing work in the cloud native space, right? And highlight to if you are building solutions with this approach, it's very likely you have a lot of solutions available for what you are trying to do. That doesn't mean I am against the cloud. I believe cloud has happened, but we can give a cloud its originally intended role as this kind of commodity infrastructure provider, Well, just as AWS used to promote the clouds a decade or so ago, right? And that was not as ubiquitous. Kubernetes is obviously a key component because it is universally available, and that can be used as a universal API in a sense, both on all the public clouds as well as on-prem, on the edge, everywhere. Right, so that's great. APIs and Kubernetes operators is the framework how you are what you're looking to look at if you're looking to deploy database on Kubernetes. And why operator in particular is important, because unlike some other solutions, like, well, I simply install the packages with Helm, for example, it focuses on both day one and day two automation, right? And day two automation is very important, especially for larger data sets, where as we created them, we expect to operate them for many years or decades in many cases. The thing of Kubernetes, though, of course, it gives us a different UX compared to your kind of typical database as a service. But maybe we can use Kubernetes as a foundation to build the database as a service, right? And I would say not only that is theoretical, but that is actually what is happening. You can see many modern database as a service are actually built on the Kubernetes in the backend. And that is something which really allows many of them to operate on multiple clouds with relatively little integration points. Now, as I started to talk about what vendor lock-in with proprietary database as a service, right, which can be problematic, especially if you're looking at the analytical databases. I wanted to flag their Altinity and the work they're doing with Altinity Cloud Anywhere solution, which allows you to run the database on your Kubernetes with Kubernetes operator, right? And so you can maximize the control of your data while have the flexibility, right, of that managed database.
4-minute warning, Peter.
Yes, at Percona, we are also working with database as a service. We are not focused on analytical databases, but MySQL, MongoDB, and Postgres. And we are implementing the completely open source database as a service as a feature in a Percona monitoring and management. It's currently work in progress, right? So it is not GA yet, but I would encourage you to check it out, give us maybe some feedback or even maybe some code, as always appreciated in the open source project. And if just having a couple of minutes left, I wanted to highlight the summary here. What we have really fantastic amount of innovation is going on in the last 5 years or so. I think there is a lot more attention to the databases than some of the times in the past. We are having evolving open source models, right? I think both in a pure open source, as various models around open source, eventual open source, source available software, and so on and so forth, right? Which in generally will bring us to their great future. And that is all I have to say on this topic.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Peter. And one of the comments was great, nice talk. Thank you so much.
Okay, well, fantastic. So let's go to our HTAP panel, I guess.
Yep, we'll see you at the next sessions on the webinar. Thank you very much, everyone.
Yes, thank you, folks.